Good afternoon. This program is going to be centered around the music of Arnold Schoenberg, a name which sometimes causes consternation, but with Token Creek Festival, it has always inspired devotion and fascination. In fact, our first official concert, was centered around a controversial work by Schoenberg, still controversial work, the Ode to Napoleon, which would be an appropriate work to include in this broadcast, but that many of our earliest recordings have disappeared. It's appropriate because it's extremely political, always of the moment, especially when we have unusual division and tension within the country. But we can't give it to you, and we can't give you another treasure from our early days, the appearance by Marnie Nixon, great Schoenbergian, along with Leonard Stein. But we will have Leonard Stein, who was as close and as versed in Schoenberg as any musician. He was Schoenberg's assistant for many years. Of course, at first, more a student of Schoenberg. He played class demonstrations for Schoenberg. He helped him edit his books. And he is more than a chronicler. He went on for many years, as you will hear, as a very persuasive performer of Schoenberg's piano music. Schoenberg loved to write for the piano. He wrote for it quite idiosyncratically. One could say in many ways in a quite original way, because he was by and large allergic to the pedal, the device on the pedal on the piano that allows certain notes to be sustained, one of the wonderful properties of the piano. But Schoenberg really in general really enjoined the pianist from using the pedal. And Leonard, having played these pieces for Schoenberg very often, was quite scrupulous in observing this. So you have a very clear image of what a piano is when you hear a Schoenberg piece. And you have a wonderful sense that the counterpoint and the chords are expressing themselves with unusual clarity. It does help to cheat a little bit once in a while. And even Leonard Stein would admit that he will color things with his right foot on occasion. But you will hear first some, at their time, extremely original notions. The piano pieces, Opus 19, when they first came out, Schoenberg and his devoted students and this rather remarkable circle of musicians that was around him at the time were quite surprised that they were so short. We really didn't have extremely short pieces at that time. It was an idea which was extremely attractive to the musicians of that period because they were confronted with music of extreme length and, shall we say, emotive power, the symphonies of Mahler, the operas of Wagner. And the best answer seemed to be extremely brief, to be even somewhat hermetic, to be mysterious, to have your say and stop. And in fact, Schoenberg's pupil and one of his most powerful successors, Anton Webern, said about his own short pieces, which he soon began writing when he heard these pieces by Schoenberg, the Opus 19, he felt that when he got through all the 12 notes, that he almost felt like the piece couldn't go on. Now, he worked beyond that, obviously, because that's not long enough. But these pieces have their say very briefly, and they spoke in a loud voice to the period, which was all about not grandiloquence, but extreme, intimate, quick, distilled expression. The paintings of Klimt, the philosophy of Freud, Vienna in an extremely excited state. Um, and actually, somewhere within the gestures of these very tiny pieces, you feel still something Viennese, a kind of momentary lilt. One of the pieces of the six is something of a waltz, but they say their say, and then they are silent. And the silence is as important as the notes. Some years later, writing again for the piano, Schoenberg was ready to take on larger forms and larger musical spaces. And he does so in a very compelling and extremely convincing way. He builds his pieces mainly around extremely memorable and powerful motives. He expresses his forms with great economy. You really have to try to catch every gesture and every note to really hear these pieces. And if these pieces have a moment for you anywhere, they are for you. One of my teachers, Roger Sessions, used to say that if there was a moment that moved you or gripped you, you may be a candidate. If not, move on. Don't beat yourself up. Come back to something else, perhaps another piece by the same composer. But Opus 23 speaks, I think, extremely eloquently to the ears that have been waiting for it. The big middle movement is one of Schoenberg's most important pieces, the one that comes at the center. It is a kind of passacaglia on a very clear theme of 5 notes. And it is a germination of a way of thinking, of thematic thinking, that becomes extremely important to him and is not so unlike Baroque music, where a motivic stretch, that is a motivic blanket, can cover really the main motivation of the piece. Behind my right shoulder here is J.S. Bach, for whom the establishment of the motive, the character of the theme, was a huge piece of the composition of a piece. The only revisions that we see of him, they are usually in the very first measures of a piece, trying to really understand what the piece can do with a small material. So, Opus 23 of Schoenberg, also played by Leonard Stein, a much more pianistic, shall we say, in the conventional sense, kind of work than Opus 19, and one which you will, if you have that moment of connection, one to which you will want to return. Berg's early songs are like a lot of composers' early music. They are both of what he will do, but they're just as much of where he comes from. They are among his most popular pieces. They still are redolent of Mahler and Brahms and of the songs of composers somewhat preceding him. They are a wonderful demonstration of his most prominent gift, the one which Schoenberg, as a teacher, felt he was depending on too much when they were working together on lessons. Melody. Berg was extremely gifted for the making of tunes. Schoenberg really felt that his job as a teacher was to make those tunes sustain a form. And he succeeded with Berg, or Berg succeeded with himself extremely well in that regard. That is, Berg's germinating impulse remains melodic, but he becomes capable of very large designs eventually, including 2 of the most significant operas of the 20th century. So here in the early songs, you hear, I won't say whistleable, but indeed memorable melody all the way through these really beautiful, inviting, extremely durable songs. The Schoenberg Fantasy is a much later piece of Schoenberg's than the ones we began the program with, the piano pieces. In fact, it's right at the end of his life. He had a heart episode in which his heart had stopped and a needle was employed to restart the heart. And thereafter, he wrote on a large music paper. His vision was somewhat impaired. His music, if anything, became even more intense and pithy and succinct and telling. Um, this piece is from that very last period. It was originally premiered in one of Schoenberg's composition classes by one of the, well, actually, I think two of the students. And it, curiously enough, this is the story, I'm not quite sure I believe it, was written first as a solo violin piece, and then Schoenberg decided that it needed a piano accompaniment. If you perform this piece often, as the two performers that you will hear have, you begin more and more to contest this yarn about this piece, because the two parts are so magically interwoven and so interdependent. The idea of it being for a while a solo violin piece, and we have experimented with hearing it that way, but that idea seems not to hold up. As a very wonderfully concise 9-minute declamatory compressed piece with maybe as many as 12 to 13, depending on how you feel it, really integrated clear sections, it's a marvel of formal invention and compression and drama, and is, as much as violinists can be adventurous enough to take it on, really a part of the modern repertoire for violin and piano. Schoenberg Fantasy, spelled quite curiously with a PH in the title. And of course, with the measures numbered in Schoenberg's characteristic fashion, always avoiding the number 13, about which he was pathologically suspicious, afraid of dying on the 13th of a month, which of course, with all of his efforts against it, he still did. But it is a piece which, like much of his late music, has an immediate dramatic presence. You'll hear it in the very first measures. It declaims itself in a kind of bravado way, which I think is characteristic of the late work of this composer. Busoni becomes part of this program because of his closeness to the Schoenberg school of composers, Berg, Webern, and Schoenberg, closeness personally and in their way of understanding him, also temperamentally. Busoni's music was really of a different era. It's still a late romantic idiom, deeply felt, sort of coming out of Liszt and Brahms and the end of the 19th century. But he is also a futurist in his thinking. He imagines a music like Schoenberg and like Berg, but beyond that, he imagines musics that we have probably not yet heard. He was a deeply progressive mind. He was also a great virtuoso pianist, and he once, I think, probably annoyed Schoenberg quite a bit, but it was a loving gesture. He made a kind of transcription of one of Schoenberg's piano pieces in more pianistic fashion, sort of speaking back to his friend Schoenberg. It wasn't taken too well by Schoenberg, as for kind of obvious reasons, but it was also an evidence of an uncommon closeness that an older composer in a very different stylistic realm would take so seriously these extremely different harmonies by a younger colleague to make a version of it that was sort of more true to his own ear. That's a kind of comradeship which I think we see very seldom between generations of composers. The Busoni Sonata, performed here by Rosemary Harbison and Leonard Stein, they performed many times. This performance is actually not on one of our programs, but on a parallel occasion. The Busoni Sonata is, in the grand style, really with a kind of leisurely, formal tread, and a climactic portion which is really deeply part of many worlds. Bach, there is a concentration on a chorale tune. Busoni was probably the greatest pianistic advocate for the music of Bach of his time. Later romantic thinking, particularly I think Brahms, and to some degree Liszt, and a deep sense of the importance of chamber music. That is to say that this is not a piece written simply to fill a place in the program. It's a piece written to dominate and to continue to speak in large terms, and has continued more and more, in fact, in recent times, to be taken up and understood by violinists and pianists. So we conclude with the grand Busoni Sonata for piano and violin, and this thus conclude this Schoenberg and colleagues and friends program, a program which means to the Token Creek Festival a unusual degree of concern, interest, satisfaction, and pleasure from the very beginning of our existence. And we hope that your ears will find it as fascinating as we have. Thank you.